All right, hello everybody, and welcome to topic 2. Today we're talking about research design. So while this is not a research class, this is a statistics class, it's still important to understand the underlying mechanisms of research so that we can understand the context in which questions will be asked in this class. So that's why we start out talking about it. So here we are. First, we're talking about conducting research. We talk about research design in two parts. First, conducting research, and then next we'll talk about types of data as a separate section here. So conducting research, how do we do it? We have a research cycle that we follow. You might think of this as the scientific method, right? This is the same mechanism as the scientific method. Where we go in order, right? We approach things in a logical sequence. So here we have a list of steps that we consider to be part of the research cycle. We start off with the questions. Remember in our last lecture, we came up with questions, right? Do lawyers have more competitive tendencies than non-lawyers? Do pet owners do they have higher health than non-pet owners, right? So we come up with a question, we come up with a hypothesis or a prediction, more on hypotheses momentarily here. Then we recruit participants, right? We gather a sample, we collect the data, we extract data from that sample, and then we analyze that data, we work with that data. And then ultimately with science, we're trying to publish information, publish statistics so that other people can benefit from what you learned from your research. And then it's a circle, right? A cycle. Once something is published, other scientists should look at it and come up with new questions based on what you found, right? There's no real end to science. So I'm sure we've all heard of the scientific method, at least somewhere in our educational careers, but here's a refresher on it for our purposes. And what I really like to point out is that it is cyclic. It's a cycle. It doesn't end, right, when you get to the end of your 7 steps. All right, so now we're on to hypotheses. Hypotheses are statements, all right? So we gave some examples of research questions, and now we're gonna have examples of hypotheses. We have an entire week where we talk about hypothesis testing. So this is really just a very brief intro to, but I will start using the term hypothesis, and we should have a vague idea of what it means. Hypotheses are statements, and they state something specific. They state a prediction between whatever variables are being assessed, all right? More on variables on our next topic here. But we'll have different things in question, right? In our examples from last time, our variables would be things like health or competitiveness or whether or not you're a lawyer or whether or not you have a pet. The null hypothesis is a term that we use that describes no difference between whatever it is that we are observing. All right, so if we take the examples we took a look at, right, a null hypothesis would say that there's no difference in health between pet owners and non-pet owners. And then we have an alternative hypothesis would suggest that there is in fact a difference. The alternative hypothesis says that there is a difference or a relationship between the variables that are being assessed. So this comes with a lot of nuances. We'll be writing hypotheses later in the semester when we get to hypothesis testing. But generally speaking, hypotheses are statements that serve as a basis for further investigation. They're statements that can be tested. So we have these two distinctions here, these two types, and again, much more on this to come, but we want to start strengthening our scientific vocabulary here. Now we're on to independent and dependent variables. Okay, again, this is not a research class. At its heart, it's a statistics class, right? But we do need to understand some of these basic concepts. And this is one that students often have a bit of difficulty with, all right? I think mainly because they sound so similar, right? The independent and the dependent variable. So for our purposes, I like to boil this down to be as simple as I think it can be, which is that the independent variable, we'll abbreviate it as the IV, that the independent variable is a predictor, that it predicts something else, all right? So in our past examples, it might be that having a pet will predict your overall well-being. It It might be that your being a lawyer is going to predict how competitive you are. We have lots of different predictions we can make, right? Maybe we'll predict that the more that you sleep, you'll see a greater increase to your mood. All right. In all of these cases, we have something that is a predictor, a variable that is a predictor. All right. And it influences the dependent variable. The dependent variable, or the DV, is the outcome or the result of the independent variable. So again, I like to keep this very simple. Independent variables are predictors, dependent variables are outcomes. And we have a nice little example over here of the independent variable being something that's maybe manipulated or changed or somewhat honed in on by the researcher. When we see how it affects, right, or how it results in changes to behavior or whatever it may be. So this example here is for drug trials or clinical trials, which are very common. So an example, right? The drug is the independent variable, and then the outcome is whatever effect the drug is intending to have, right? Maybe these are sleeping pills, but this is happening all of the time, right, with different trials for different drugs. So I think it's a simple way to think about the independent and dependent variable. So the next thing we'll talk about is defining our variables, all right? And what is a variable? A variable is anything that can vary, right? Anything that has more than one possible outcome. So we can think of lots of variables, and that's what the second part of this lecture is for, is to kind of flush out the different types of data and types of variables we have. But regardless, whenever we're working with a certain type of variable, we want to define what that variable is. So we have something called operational definitions, in which we describe, in terms of the procedure or processes used to measure a concept. We describe the terms which we are using. So let's take intelligence for an example here. There are lots of different ways that we can measure intelligence, right? You can take an intelligence test. That'll tell you something about intelligence. But we can also quantify intelligence in a couple of different ways. And the idea here is maybe some of these are less good than others, okay? So say we're taking intelligence and we're defining it as our score on a verbal SAT test, all right? Or maybe we're defining it as how quickly we can perform a task, something like repairing an engine. Or maybe we take a standard IQ test, or maybe we ask people to self-rate their intelligence, right? Here's a lot of different versions of intelligence, or ways that we could perhaps measure it. And one of these might be better than others, right? Maybe using an actual IQ test. But the point here is that when we're reading research, or when we hear statements about variables being made, we should think to ourselves, how is the researcher defining that variable, right? It's not always as clear-cut as you might think. And we are a little cut off on the bottom there, so I'll scoot us up. Perfect. But here we have it, right? One variable can have multiple different meanings or definitions, and we want to make sure that the definitions are strong, right? And that we agree with how a researcher is defining a certain variable. Maybe you don't think that the speed of repairing an engine has anything to do with intelligence, right? Our psychological definition would say probably not. But there we have it, right? We have a variety of ways we can define variables. All right, now we're moving into another kind of overarching research topic, an overarching statistical concept, which is randomization. And we're going to talk about it specific to sampling. All right, so the recruitment process, right? If we're moving through the steps of the research cycle, next we're talking about recruiting participants. How are we going to recruit them, right? How are we going to sample individuals to participate in our studies? So we can sample from a group, right? We take a larger population. We want to grab a small subset of individuals from that population. We can do this in a couple of ways. We can do it randomly, or we can do it non-randomly, okay? So random versus non-random. Random means that every person has an equal chance of being selected. Or if you're not looking at people, right, maybe you're doing animal research. It's that every single animal of that population has an equal chance of being selected. So this is a nice idea, right? It means that we should have equal representation, a word we'll talk about in a minute, because we're polling people randomly from a group. But if we start to think a little bit more about it, it's a little bit difficult to randomly poll people from a group if we're talking about this definition of randomness, meaning that every person has an equal chance of being selected. So random is another one of those statistical terms that's used in our common language, right? Uh, if your friend says they want tacos for lunch and you say, haha, that's so random, that's not really random, right? Random in statistics is something very specific and it has to do with probability. So we can think about, okay, how do we go about randomly polling a sample out of our population of interest randomly, right? To do it non-randomly would be easy, right? We can just grab some people and have them take part in our study. But sometimes we want to be a little bit more careful than that. And most importantly, we want our sample to be representative of the population that we are polling from. So we're always aiming for representative samples. Which are a subset of the population that actually contains characteristics of that larger group. So we try to achieve this with randomness, but it doesn't always work. So randomness is not a guarantee for representation, but it's a step in the right direction, all right? We're going to talk about different ways that you can get a more representative sample. So we can think of ways we would randomly sample, okay? Say we want to survey every student at our institution, right? We have a couple thousand, right? More than a couple thousand, over 10,000 we have. Let's say we want to sample them randomly. How could we do it? All right, we could put everyone's name on a piece of paper and draw it out of a hat, right? That'd be a pretty big hat. That's not very practical. More often than not in the modern day, we use technology to help us, right? If you have, say, a list of every student at our institution, you can assign them a random number and then select however many of those values that you want for your sample, right? Maybe you want an N or a sample size of 200. You can tell the computer, hey, pull me 200 of these participants at random, all right? So we use random number generators. For all my gamers out there, this is RNG. If you've heard that term, RNG, this is what it's referring to. Random number generation is used in a lot of processes to create random outcomes, right? Or outcomes of a certain probability. So randomness is great, but it's not always achievable, right? Think about how difficult it would be to access and get contact with every single student on campus. And in addition to that, you would need to think about how many people are going to, say, respond or give you their data, right? It's always voluntary. So sometimes randomness isn't exactly the best route to go because it's a bit difficult. It's a bit time consuming. So we have some other ways that we can modify random sampling, and then we have non-random samples that we can rely on as well. So let's take an example of another type of random sampling. This is called stratified random sampling. This is a structured sample. So instead of pulling straight from the population, what we would do is create subgroups within a population and then look at them in this way. In this way, you can make groups equally represented. So let's say that you wanted to take a look across 3 different majors, all right? Maybe you wanted to look at the nursing major, the psychology major, and then you wanted to look at, say, the chemistry majors. Well, those 3 groups are not equally represented, right? Nursing is often the largest major on most campuses, right? Psychology is also usually a pretty large major across college campuses. Chemistry, perhaps not so much at this particular institution. So if we wanted to make our sample representative, right, or make sure that everybody was represented, or say we didn't want to overlook those that are chemistry majors, we could create what we call strata here. So this image we have, first of all, it has a typo, polulation. I've been using this figure for a while now, and that makes me laugh every time. But we go from the population, right, every example member of the group, and then we could create strata or specific groups that we're interested in looking at. Take different majors, for example, and then we can randomly sample from those strata. That means that those that have less numbers, right, in the population still have a chance of being selected. And Another way to think of this is with ethnic groups on campus, right? If we have ethnic groups that are more pronounced or prominent than others on campus, we can use stratified random sampling to make sure that we're not overlooking an entire group, right, that's less present on our campus. So this is a very useful tool for random sampling. Some people might call this non-random sampling, right? But there's a layer of random sampling in here that we're sampling randomly from the strata that we create. So now let's take a look at non-random sampling. So random sampling is held at a higher spot than non-random sampling because it's thought to be better, right, or more representative, which is great. But again, we're talking about how difficult it is to achieve. So it's not always the best route for researchers to go. So we have some forms of non-random sampling that we will discuss here. We have convenient sampling, or people who are easily recruited. Okay, I think this image does a pretty good job of explaining this, right? This is someone standing outside of a grocery store and just asking people to give them some data, right? To take a survey. It's convenient. It's whoever we can find, right? We're not taking every example member of the population and randomly selecting them for our sample. We're just getting a sample of those who we can easily get data from. So this is limited, of course, because you might be getting by proxy of your method here a certain type of person, right? Maybe you're out doing this in front of two different stores, right? Maybe the data you would collect on a certain issue outside of a Walmart is different if you collected it outside of a Target, right? Who knows? But it's a limitation of this type of sample. We have snowball sampling, which is when participants refer other similar participants. So this is often used in groups that are difficult to reach. We use this in autism spectrum disorder research in my field, right? If we have someone on the spectrum come in for a research study, we ask them, do you have any friends that might be interested in participating, right? Do you know anybody else who might be interested in participating? Since they're more prominent perhaps in the population of interest than the researcher is. We use this as well for things like addiction, for individuals who might not be seeking research out themselves. But if one person's involved, they can refer others they know that are in similar positions, so on and so forth. All right, so again, it's not quite the same as random sampling. It doesn't give us the same representation that we would hope for, but it's a way to get data, right? Some data is better than no data, and some data is very difficult to get our hands on. Then we have one more type of non-random sampling called purposive sampling. We can think of this as case studies, if we've heard of this term before. It's when we select an individual based on a specific interest, right? Maybe we pick somebody who had a stroke and has damage to a particular part of their brain, and we want to know what the outcome of that damage was, right? We would select that person and do some research on them. We have to have a good reason for doing this. We can take some other examples like autistic savants, right, that have amazing abilities. Maybe we want to pick them out and study them to try and understand how they've garnered such amazing abilities. So this is a more restricted form of sampling, but one that's necessary when we're looking at very restricted cases of incidents. So. All right, let's take a look at some issues with sampling. Okay, so remember we talked about last time how sampling is kind of the core of statistics, right? That's what they are. Statistics are numbers used to describe data from samples, right? Samples of people. But our statistics are only as good as our sample, or as our samples, so to speak. Our samples are not always representative of our population, and we always don't have a good glimpse of the entire population, right? If we're trying to make a statement about, say, all women in the world, there are billions of women, depending on the size of our sample, we're probably covering a very small amount of the true information that is out there. So we're going to expand a lot on this when we start doing inferential statistics. We can make pretty strong inferences based on small samples back to the population, but we have to have a good sample, right? We have to start with a good sample. We have to start with good data, which is hard to achieve. So again, this is not a research class, so we're not going to be talking about these topics throughout the class. We're going to start practicing statistics, but it's important to know the basis of what we're working with, right? We should think about how good our sample is. The more samples that we have, the larger the samples we have, or the closer we get to the actual population, the less error we see in our statistics. We'll start using this term error more, all right? There's always error in our statistics, which is sometimes hard for people to overcome, right? When you're doing work, when you're doing science, you want to minimize error, right? Keep the error as little as possible, but you can't eliminate it, right? You can't get rid of it entirely. So it's one of those limitations of statistics, right? That there's always some error because we simply do not have all the information. If we did, we wouldn't be doing research in the first place. So we have to make friends with error, all right? We got to get cozy with it. All right, so now we're going to talk about three major types of research, three major types of studies, and the major distinctions between them. All right, so I've abbreviated this quite a bit. There's a lot of text here, so I do apologize. But we have some major distinctions here with types of data, all right, or types of studies based on the type of data that we have. So we've been using this word descriptive. We've talked about descriptive statistics. There are descriptive studies, which simply describe situations, all right? They don't make any inferences or conclusions. They just describe what is seen, right? Think a behavioral psychologist watching kids play on a playground, right? And just describing it, right? If we just describe information, right, if we do a study where we're just describing numerically or describing with statistics, right, how often behaviors are occurring, that's great, right? It helps us to understand further, but it doesn't determine, say, the cause and effect of two different variables. So that's a limitation, right? We can describe phenomena, but that's about it to a point, right? We can do correlational studies in which we describe if two different variables are related. So again, much more on correlations to come, but correlational studies also do not determine cause and effect. They simply suggest whether or not two variables move with each other, all right? As one variable goes up, does the other go up, right? Maybe skills and income. As our skills increase, our income should increase, right? Hopefully, anyway. That's why we work so hard to develop skills. Does one decrease as the other decreases? Maybe as your nutrition increases, your health problems decrease, right? So these are co-relationships or relationships that work together. We had the silly example last time about pool drownings and Nicolas Cage films. Not that drowning is funny, but the relationship certainly is, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense, which is why correlations also can't imply cause and effect, right? Because two things can vary with each other and have nothing to do with each other, so they cannot determine cause and effect. And then we have experimental studies where we have some systematic variation of a variable that's thought to be causal. Helps us to determine cause and effect relationships. And we use random assignment of variables. All right, so let's take an example that we've maybe heard about before. We've maybe heard that violent video games cause violence. All right, maybe you've heard this before. Violent video games cause violence. Okay, so let's think about that. For an experiment, we need to manipulate, all right, the independent variable or the predictor, right? Independent variable is the predictor, which in this case would be violent video games, right? We're saying that violent video games predict aggression in kids, right? Or violence in kids. So violent video games is the predictor, aggression or violence in kids is the outcome, the dependent variable. So in order to make a statement saying that violent video games cause aggression in kids, we would have to randomly assign the independent variable, meaning that we would have had to have a study where we took groups of children, gave half of them violent media to engage in, and half of them non-violent media, and then compared over time their aggression. Well, think of what parent would sign their kid up for a study where they're being shown violent media, right? We don't have information, we don't have samples or data or statistics to make that kind of claim. We can maybe do a correlational study, right? Take a child and ask, okay, how much violent media are you consuming? And then get an aggression measure on the kid. But that would be a correlation, and we can't determine cause and effect So if you've heard the word cause thrown around in research, be careful, be mindful of what that means. Only certain studies can attribute cause and effect. So let's take a look at a visual for this here. So here we have the population, the whole group. Well, moving the wrong thing. We have the population, all right, the entire group that we're interested in making a statement about. We can randomly select a sample, and then we have another layer of randomness here where we would randomly assign individuals to one of two groups. In this example, to a group with violent media or nonviolent media. So again, not very practical, not something that we have a lot of data on, but we use this exact same mechanism in lots of different studies. The most common might be drug trials, right? An example we looked at earlier in this lecture, right? We would say take a population from, let's use another psychological disorder, let's use ADHD, right, an attention disorder. Let's say that we're taking from a population everybody that has ADHD. We pull a random sample of those with ADHD, and then we want to test a new drug, right? Then we would randomly assign that sample that we gained to either be part of the control or treatment group, to either receive no pill or a pill, and see how the medication works, right? How does the medication work? Do we see a reduction in symptoms? Right, and then looping this all the way back to our independent and dependent variables. The independent variable would be whether or not the individuals receive the drug. That'd be the predictor, right? The medication. And then the outcome or the dependent variable would be the ADHD symptoms, right? So this is to point out that we work in a very systematic way in science and with statistics. This is a true experimental design, but we often get information reported in the cause and effect format, which is really not true unless we've gone through all of this work, right? So we just need to be careful. And on the topic of being careful, the last thing we'll talk about here is bias. Again, a word we're maybe familiar with. If somebody is biased, and everybody is biased. Everybody comes into situations with a form of bias. Doesn't mean it's negative, but it means that we have it and we should be aware of it. And bias can seep its way into research at almost every level, all right? We can have a biased reason for coming up with a theory or an idea in science. We can have biased hypotheses. We can make our samples biased, right? Maybe we're trying to suggest that a textbook we've written is so great, right? And maybe we give that textbook to only very high achieving students. And we say in our sample, students who used our textbook excelled academically, right? That's a biased sample because you pick students that were already academically strong. That's the importance of random sampling. Experimental design, right? You can set up your experiments in such a way that they might suggest a result that you're wanting to achieve. And again, I have to hold my tongue a bit because I teach research methods as well, and we have so many reasons we need to concern ourselves with bias or the origin of our data or of our studies, right? It can be anywhere. And we can even interpret results in a biased way. So think back to those kind of crazy statistics I showed in the first topic, right? We can maybe come up with an interpretation for those nonsense relationships that seems maybe plausible, right? So we can be biased at every step of the way here. All right, so that does it for our first part of research design. We have a part 2 to research design, our third topic on types of data, so I will see you on that one.